Good evening and welcome to today's event celebrating the publication of Bernd and Hilla Becher, the catalogue which accompanies the exhibition of the same name, curated by Jeff Rosenheim at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The exhibition will remain on view until November 6th and will then travel to the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art from December 17th until April 2nd of 2023. Although I have long admired the Becher's photographs, their collaborative project seemed until now to exist fully formed. Here, we learn how the artist arrived at the highly refined images that we associate with their names and the unique skills and experiences each brought to the partnership. To see the works of Bernd Becher and Hilla Urbanelli before they met, side by side in the catalogue and the galleries, is nothing short of a revelation. Bernd Becher's attempts to capture the complexities of industrial architecture in pencil on paper coalesced with Hilla Becher's photographic studies of machine parts that were so accurate they were used by technicians as reference images. Throughout the book, the authors generously build an understanding of the overall context in which the photographers worked. For example, the way in which the structures they photographed were understood in culture more generally before their project, and the way in which the Bechers, as photographers, entered and navigated the art world. The three essays are complemented by a conversation between Jeff Rosenheim and the Becher's son, Max Becher, who provides fascinating anecdotes about his parents' life and work and dispels numerous established myths and misunderstandings. Jeff Rosenheim will be joined this evening in conversation by one of the three contributors, Lucy Sante, and the book's editor, Elisa Urbanelli, who will moderate the conversation. I'll briefly introduce the three of them and then hand over to Elisa. Jeff Rosenheim is the Joyce Frank Menschel Curator in charge of the Department of Photographs at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Rosenheim has published books on Diane Arbus, Irving Penn, the Anne Tenenbaum and Thomas H. Lee collection, and photography and the American Civil War. Lucy Sante is a writer whose books include Low Life, Kill All Your Darlings, The Other Paris, Maybe the People Would Be the Times, and most recently, 19 Reservoirs. She teaches the history of photography and writing at Bard College. Elisa Urbanelli is senior editor at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where she has edited numerous award-winning catalogues, including Alexander McQueen, Savage Beauty, Gerhard Richter, Painting After All, Irving Penn, Centennial, and Michelangelo, Divine Draftsman and Designer. Please join me in welcoming Jeff, Lucy, and Elisa in the conversation about Bernd and Hilla Becher. And if you have any questions to be addressed at the end, please email them to evan@192books.com. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Sorry for the delay. And thank you, Daisy. I hope you can hear me now. I have drafted some questions to help guide our conversation, and I will volley back and forth between Jeff and Lucy. I'll start with Jeff. This is the first monograph to be published about the Bechers without their involvement. And both it and the exhibition were a long time in the making. Can you tell us about how this project developed and specifically the book?
Thank you, Elisa, and thank you, Daisy, as well, and everyone at 192. This is a project that had a long gestation period. It began long before COVID, but COVID extended it a few years. The idea was brought to the Met, actually, to me and my colleague, Doug Eklund, by the director of a museum in Düsseldorf, quite near the Kunstakademie, where Bernd taught and where Bernd and Hilla met in the late 1950s. That museum, the Kunstpalast, which is somewhat of an encyclopedic museum, began thinking about doing a retrospective after Hilla's death. She died a bit after Bernd did. And they were looking for an American partner. And this was a dream come true for me personally and for my colleague, Doug, I would say. And we began slowly working on this project about 5+ years ago. And along the way, various things happened, not just COVID, but that museum dropped doing the show, that director left. The museum, the Met, was planning for this to be in our Breuer Building initiative, and that enterprise ended, and then COVID happened. The book itself was really interesting because there had never really been an independent exhibition curated outside of the Becher's own world of the Becher's work. They made their own books. They were artist books. They did what they wanted. They shared what they wanted. And no one had really gotten in to see the underpinnings of their work, which are fascinating. And once we saw that, I think we decided we had to find a way to work with the estate and the archive in Cologne, where the Bechers themselves placed their work. And that's what is so beautifully and perfectly calibrated by you, Elisa. That's what's so exciting about the publication. I hope it will turn people on to the Becher's work and not demystify anything, but expand it.
Oh, and certainly having our access to the archives was a wonderful contribution to the story, and we do try to illustrate a lot of that background material throughout. I'm just, these photos on the right are a good example of that. I don't think much of this material had ever really been seen before.
Yeah, for reasons that artists typically like to hide their methods if they're after something larger than just process. But here we have on the left, Hilla and Bernd creating or laying out a typology of blast furnaces, perhaps even the one that's in the exhibition. And on the right are two pictures, hard hat pictures of them at work. And they didn't follow the typical style of photography, fine art photography of the era, which was very subjective, handheld, Leica 35mm photography, begun by Cartier-Bresson, then picked up by Robert Frank and Gary Winogrand and Lee Friedlander, all of whom were making bird's eye and worm's eye views and angled presentations because they were tired of the documentary style, and the Bechers returned it to its authoritative center.
That's interesting. I wanted to ask you a little bit about that, but first, if you don't mind, I'd like to turn to Lucy. And this is a great, well, if you go back one, Rachel, sorry. This is a great segue into my question to Lucy, and that is, you mentioned in your essay that you grew up in Belgium, close to a site that the Bechers later photographed. Can you talk a bit about your personal connection to their work, starting in particular with this image?
Unmute. Thank you, Elisa. Well, I'm very moved to find this image on the cover of the catalog and the introductory image of the show. It's the water tower from my hometown, Verviers, Belgium. I don't recall ever seeing it. It's somewhere out in the landscape. It's on the fringes somewhere, as I can tell by the trees. But it's just such a wonderful object. It's so Jules Verne to me. It's a bathysphere atop a lighthouse. So I'm from this town where industry collapsed in the 1950s. It was basically a one industry town. It was a textile town. And it started collapsing in around the end of the 1950s, 1957 or 58. And well, long and short of it, my father lost his employment and there were no other jobs to be had. And rather than collect unemployment or go to the Belgian Congo, which people were still doing then, he took up a childhood friend of his who'd married an American GI after the war and moved to New Jersey. And that's what we did. The same year that Bernd and Hilla Becher started on their project, 1959. We came back to Europe a year later. We made several attempts, and I had this very crazy mixed up childhood back and forth between the two. But you can see in the previous picture and in this one with my father, the brick buildings. This was the previous picture. I just wanted to go back to that for a second, because that was my grandparents' street. I mean, all four grandparents. And it was an industrial street. It had just a few residential buildings. And you can see in this view, which is the reverse angle to that one, or rather the other end of the street, not reverse angle, you can see factories. And that street is gone now. There is no trace that it was ever there. This is the street where my parents met. So industry, as I knew it, as I was born into it, as every male member of my family going back to somewhere maybe in the Middle Ages, worked in the textile industry in Verviers. We've always been in this town, and that's what one did. And now that it's gone, what has replaced it? And the answer is not much. It's in distress. So anyway, looking at these pictures, and my father moved to the United States, but continued working in factories. So I'm familiar with the industrial landscape. I myself worked in factories when I was in my late teens. This is Charleroi, which is it's one of those areas. There were all these no-go areas, in the past, not just in Belgium, but everywhere. Areas you wouldn't want to drive through if you had a car, because it was ugly, it was smelly, it was hot. When we lived in a steel town, my mother would take me out in my stroller, and I'd come back with my blanket covered with little burn marks from cinders that flew out of the smokestacks. So, this was a blight on the landscape. But as with so many things, it's irreplaceable. And, these colossal structures, many of them erased from the face of the earth. And I realized, and I remember realizing when I was still in my 20s, looking at the Becher's photographs, the beauty of these places, which formerly I disregarded, that they have this beauty, but also they're not standardized. Many of them were built on site. No two things really look exactly alike, which is what the Bechers were exploiting in their photographs.
Lucy, can I jump in? First of all, this picture on the left in this in the pairing here, that brick building with the slight arch top to those portals, if you will, if they could have gotten far enough back, it looks like there's a building across the street. It's just the kind of building they would have photographed.
Exactly. I took that picture myself, and unfortunately, as you can see, there wasn't enough room to stand back. But yeah. But
back, what I was going to ask you is that if we go to the Charleroi landscape, we do see beauty in them, but it's oddly a quiet beauty, a non-odoriferous beauty, a non-cindery beauty. And I'm wondering if that's one of the things that the camera does. It in a certain sense, it transforms by its own attention the thing depicted, and done well, as opposed to done just ably, done well, all of those forms come together to create something bigger than the sum of its parts. And I think that's one of the things I get from the Bechers.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Well,
I mean, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, go on.
No, please.
That's okay. Finish your thought.
It was just a stray thought. It's not important.
Well, I was going to return to something that Jeff had said earlier, and made me think of a statement in the introduction that, you know, the Bechers had changed the course of 20th century photography. And I wondered if you might want to talk a little bit about how their methodology or their style or their choice of subject matter, all of those things really differed from what other artists were doing who worked in this medium at the time. And a few of the comments that you just made about that previous slide that made me think about how different their approach was.
Yeah, so they came from a tradition that they understood. Two parts: the tradition of the study that science, the careful approach to form that science has always followed, the collecting of specimens, the ordering of data, the simple compare and contrast, the idea that the camera allows us to see clearly where this particular plant form is different from another, or this fossil form of a house, let's say, facade of a house is similar or different from the facade of another house. In this case, we're looking at the same house photographed, its four faces and four corners. This is one of their breakthrough ideas, is to see the built environment, the architectural built environment, even of a house, and to be able to see it in the round, to photograph it as if it's a sculpture in a studio, a small object you could put on a turntable. And they weren't just doing this to be able to say they had photographed all 8 sides, if you will, of a house, but they wanted to take the eye on a journey as if they were, in fact, had created the sculpture. And they liked challenging us as viewers to see the world for its sculptural, let's say, beauty, its sculptural form. And that was not really what was happening in the 50s and 60s. And this is one of their breakthroughs, that the built environment, and let's call it some parts of the vernacular built environment, the neglected industrial forms, had cultural value by their simple presence. And then they had to solve the technical problem of how to show them. And very early on, they decided to fill each of the frames with the same amount of the building, no matter how big or small. You can't understand the scale difference in their work. And then they allow us to see them, as we do in this comparative juxtaposition on the right, to be able to see them for their sculptural attitudes, their own poetics. And you know, Lucy and I have talked about this in You and I. When they emerged in the late 60s and 70s, they had no idea that in 1990, Germany would propose them for the Venice Biennale. It's a Biennale this year. And lo and behold, they did a show and they won the premier prize, the Golden Lion, not for photography, but for sculpture. That's remarkable.
It certainly is. And I'm always struck by the fact that they, you know, they devised rules that they had to follow and sort of established this whole set of criteria that they would use to approach their subject matter. And that doesn't seem like something that other photographers were doing. You know, maybe conceptual artists were doing it, but not necessarily photographers. So it definitely sets them apart in a way.
Yeah, maybe Lucy will jump in. I was just going to say that the way this is a good example. These are chemical factory, the innards of a chemical factory or many chemical factories. They look so clean and beautiful. And even the way they appear in this catalog, which is beautifully printed, and the challenge was for all of us was, and it is, I think, especially now for me, in my personal and professional life, is to follow artists who reveal their passion and their commitment to their subject or subjects. And in this case, the physicality of their description of their subject. They loved these buildings and parts of buildings. And we needed to get that right in the book. We needed the reproductions to be sharp as a tack as they are in the flesh. And we needed to be able to contain things that are 20 feet wide. A 30-part typology is 20 feet wide or more on the wall, and we needed to get it to fit into the book. And we needed to tell that story somehow with just reduced scale. So thank you.
Well, here's a perfect example of a typology that needed a lot of space.
No.
I'd like to pivot to a question for Lucy, and that is, in your essay, you discuss how the photographs exist within a tradition of mostly European images of labor and industry. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about these art historical precedents, and also maybe how their work related to vernacular photography as well, which I don't think we have any images of here in the slideshow, but certainly in your essay we do.
Well, thank you. Well, what I talked about was actually, I mean, not a tradition, but actually the paucity of images of industrial labor that existed in any kind of visual representation. And I kind of trace it in art, and really one of the, maybe the earliest picture of labor I could find was the Coulbet Stonebreakers, which was destroyed in the bombing of Dresden, 1849 then. And above you have the painting of Constantin Meunier, a Belgian artist, kind of an academician, you know, one of these people who'd go to Cairo and paint Cairo and then come back and he'd have 30 pictures of Cairo. Well, he was sent by the Belgian government to document the mines, and he developed this visual vocabulary of the heroic worker, which came up again and again in the 20th century, was used by the Soviets, was used by the Nazis. But he, you know, he meant it to be the dignity of labor. Other than that, he did not, and also he represented the sheer ugliness of the industrial landscape, because he focused on, you know, withered trees, blasted landscapes, unhealthy looking skies, that kind of thing. And that you just do not see very much in history of art. As far as photography is concerned, there was documentation of industrial sites, especially around the turn of the century, when, you know, this massive popular discovery of photography meant that people were taking pictures of all sorts of stuff. And so you can find photographs taken by amateurs or postcards from the early 20th centuries that show factories. Again, the postcards are mostly from Europe. Yeah, there's the Van Gogh picture on the left there, when he was, one of the first pictures he made after going to the Borinage, the Black Country in Western Belgium, which is a site of a lot of coal mining. He went there to become an evangelist and had a nervous breakdown. And when he came out of it, started drawing, and that's one of the first drawings. So anyway, there really the documentation of factories and so on is so utterly catch as catch can, and so much mostly outside the precincts of art or photographic history as we know them.
There were some American precedents as well. Maybe Jeff, you might want to mention those.
Yeah, sure. The language of the Bechers, the vocabulary, and even their syntax, I would say, is their own, but it is built on some of the precisionist painters like Charles Sheeler, even Walker Evans from the 30s, Sheeler from the 20s, but it does look back to the 19th century even further. Artists like Carlton Watkins in the West, or the Bisson Frères in France. But in each case, those artists were generally working within the realm of industry. Watkins was working for the railroad. The French photographers were working for the government, for the, Marville included, for the arrondissement and for the mission héliographique, just trying to record the architectural patrimony of France. The Bechers had a artistic concept from the beginning. They were doing this for their own reasons. They didn't accept commissions. The exception was they did accept an invitation to come to Wales in the Thatcher era and did some very, very good work, including in the last slide, that picture from the 60s. But for the most part, this was a project to serve their own community of two. Hilla for Bernd and Bernd for Hilla, as far as we know. And interestingly, in their own pedagogy through the Kunstakademie, they would affect such people as Andreas Gursky, Thomas Struth, Candida Hoffer, Thomas Roof, by their methods, by their seriousness of purpose, by their passion, by their demanding technique that was so particularly out of date. It's hard to tell a picture from 1959 from 2003 because they didn't alter their technique once they chose it. It's fascinating. It means that they can have in a typology, maybe we can go to a big typology.
Right, I was going to ask you about that. The fact
look at this. Sorry, Elisa. Look at the date there is right there. There are pictures from 1966, all the 70s, all the 80s until 1993. To make this, how many is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, a 24-part typology. It took them many decades. And they needed to put pictures together to tell a visual story. But they were creating a new kind of sculptural form for the showing of photographs. Not that grids had not been done before. Of course, they had in book form, and they had certainly done in the history of science. And there are many examples of it. But for pictures on the wall and pictures in books that were made in the way they did, it was really a breakthrough decision. And they had to have made the decision formally at the very beginning before they knew how far it would go. So it's a fascinating story.
Can I jump in with something?
Yeah.
Sure.
I'm also, remembering that when I first encountered the Becher's work, it wasn't in a photographic context. It was in the context of the kind of art that was being done in the early 70s. And that meant two things. It meant conceptualism and a kind of post-industrialism, I guess, because, there were all these artists. Robert Morris comes to mind. I mean, there were so many of them, Richard Serra too, who got their start by, they'd rent former industrial lofts in former industrial districts, but there would be still industry going on. And so many of them used as their primary materials the discards they found on the street from these places. At the same time, the conceptual artists were very interested in classification, a certain kind of scientism, you might call it, that was sometimes, sometimes assumed, sometimes real, and sometimes kind of parodic. but they were doing it for real. The Bechers, they really had a system of classification going on. But so they fit right in. It was the zeitgeist. I mean, they weren't doing things that exactly resembled what any of these other people were doing, but there was a common spirit which united them, which was, in fact, again, the end of industry. Right. And also a certain way of refusing the art object. And I don't know anything about their commercial practices, but they were operating in the world where, mostly people were exhibiting stuff that could not be sold. And you'd see their work in like Avalanche magazine. And it would be years before I ever saw the Bechers in a properly photographic context.
Right. That's really nice. And I think let's leave this on the screen, these New York water towers, for a moment. This idea that people like Carl Andre would just use the industrial process, have an idea to create a sculpture made of identical pieces, or Saul LeWitt to create a endless variety of the square and remove parts of it to see how much he could remove, and everyone would know it was a square, a cube, if you will. And this idea, and you mentioned Sarah and Richard Long, so many others, that there was also a denial of the traditional kind of figurative beauty. These are coming out at the same time that Warhol is using the photographic aspect of his understanding to transform what painting is. And this is going in a different direction. This is going into a more hermetic place. And it's a delight to be able to present in the catalog and in the show at least two examples of contemporary sculpture by LeWitt and Andre. And I think they work together, both their scale and palette, their materiality, but also their gesture towards a kind of minimalist conceptualism.
While we're on the water towers, these are such iconic New York structures, and it brings to mind your interview with Max Becher, which is full of fascinating anecdotes, and some of them have to do with his spending time in New York as a child and traveling around in the United States with his parents. And I wondered if maybe you could.
Oh, this is great. Yeah.
I wonder if maybe you could. Daisy had mentioned that he wanted to dispel some myths about his parents in the interview that you conducted, and I wonder if you might touch on some of those.
Sure. Like in every artist family, Max was around for a lot of the pictures, including obviously this one. I like the mirroring going on here. So this is a picture of Max looking at presumably his father, photographing him and his mother. And of course, the Winding Tower in the background in France. And it's perfectly calibrated. It's got the VW bug in it and all the other stuff. But what I think what Max thought was useful, and I thought as well, was that in this interview he could talk about where his parents' very refined process was misunderstood. Like one that they didn't change anything, that they only photographed really on overcast days, or that they always photographed each building from the same distance and perspective from it. This is a good example of sort of how they worked. The snapshot Polaroid on the left, their assistant and student, Chris Durham, who worked on the project with us, photographing them in their red van at a grain elevator. And then there's the picture in the book from 2006. But I think that the Becher's practice, they didn't tell us a lot during their lifetime of what they were doing. I think this book, particularly good example to see, we realized that to get permission to do this work, it was a lot of note-taking, a lot of travel, a lot of permissions granted and denied. Bernd was trained as a draftsman and as a typographer. And I think you can see his skill with pencil. And there they are, they're making notes in their journals that they carried everywhere they went of what they wanted to do. This is mostly in the Midwest.
I love this notebook so much. This is a good example of the kind of material that has never really been seen before. And you touched on his skills, as a draftsman, and I think we have in the next slide or one after some examples of his work. So the book and the exhibition include early work by both Bernd and Hilla, work that they produced individually, even though they'd already begun their partnership, they still did their own work. And we have some examples here, and I wondered if maybe you could talk a little bit about what they reveal about each of the Bechers and what they brought to the project as a duo.
Sure. Are you asking me, or you want to ask?
Well, you can both answer this question.
I'll jump in just a little bit, but Lucy, please join me. The earliest work in the show is this one on the left, the 1952 drawing of a mason's workshop. And I think one of the questions that always came up about the Becher's work, and Max tried to dispel, was that they were not interested in the people that did it, that there's no presence of the workers in their pictures. So here's a good example. This is a mason's workshop. We can see the stove. We can see the floats, the big, large float that is sitting on the floor. We can see the pail, work clothes, the stack for the float, but everything is separated. So you can see all overalls. You can see the tools of the trade. It's a picture of a worker who's not present. Same for the lithograph on the right, which was such a pleasure to find both of these in the collection of the family collection. You can see how well he's able to synthesize. Bernd was able to synthesize. This is before, both are made before he met Hilla. Hilla was trained as a photographer. She was from East Germany, from Potsdam. And here are 4 examples of some leaf studies that she did. She was very interested in science and the Linnaean system, and used it and brought its structure into the relationship. They were perfect partners in the sense that they each had different skills, different interests, but a profound interest in working together, which makes them exceptional. The deep structure of those leaves, the architecture of the forms, and the ability to see the leaf structure is the same thing. They wanted to see every bolt and every nut and every detail of the buildings they photographed. And that's why they generally didn't work in direct sunlight, because it obscured the details.
It's so beautiful to see their early work side by side, because it's such a portrait of their particular partnership that you see in Bernd's photo montages, his struggles to capture the scale of industry. And then Hilla is about essence,
Yes.
She's not, perfectly proportioned, everything, everything visible, the whole circulatory system should be visible, but it should be contained within the picture plane. And so the two of them coming together produces the infant, which is their work. It's so perfect.
Yeah, really nice, Lucy. She was interested in the sculptural value and also the silhouette value of the forms they were photographing. And he was interested in the type of structure. And it took him until he met Hilla, I don't think he knew how to take his profound interest in this form and its history and to bring it into the realm of art practice. And I think these are especially those photo collages, long before Hockney or anyone else were doing these photo collages, but after Moholy and Man Ray were doing similar things in the 20s. But there was a whole long period where no one ever did anything like this. We could have had a very different artist if Bernd hadn't met Hilla. We would have had an artist, but it would have been a very different kind of artist. Still, on the left, I think we can see something very interesting. We can see a little bit of synthesis and a little bit of the problem of silhouette, but it doesn't really work. And if we move forward into Hilla's work, I think you can see here and in the metal forms a very strong interest in the figure-ground relationship as being really critical to the success of the partnership.
I wanted to, Rachel, can you advance the slide? I think it's, oh, not that one. Don't we have the crossword puzzles?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good.
So I've heard both of you talk about the humor in their work, and I thought you might elaborate a little bit on that. And I know you, Jeff, you discussed that a little bit with Max in your interview, that that they did have a sort of a way of looking at this with a humorous, or maybe, I don't know, maybe not ironic, but some sort of humorous detachment.
Maybe Lucy will join and I'll throw some ideas out.
Well, for me, the deadpan quality of their work itself is kind of humorous in a way.
But also the fact that, so many of these structures become faces or become individuals. And I particularly love the one of the 9 objects with different functions, because they're caricatures in a way. They're all, character types. And here, the crossword puzzle pictures, which are not in the catalog, I think, right?
Yeah,
those are their.
They're there.
Oh, they are? Okay. Those are their pictures of framework houses in the 60s. And who put them into the crossword puzzle?
Bernd.
Oh, I see. He just collaged them in.
Yeah.
Okay. I was wondering if they were printed that way.
No.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, that's beautiful. That's perfect. Of course.
Yeah. So just a little inside baseball, which I appreciate. They're not just any pictures of the framework houses that were placed into these, inserts in magazines or, drugstore or railroad, kiosk purchases to while away the time. But they're a particular kind of framework house. It's the framework house form, which they identified and classified as such, known as the house within the house. And if you look carefully on the right, wow, the original house was smaller and it was enlarged at some point. And so we have a house within the house. And on the left, you can really see that the left part of the house is the house within a house that was expanded. So the original house might be from 1890, but The house we're looking at is maybe from 1940. And when the Bechers did their research, they were delighted to find these different types of X-ray visions of a life, of a family. And when they did this work, it was very important to them. They did a complete anthropological, sociological study. They noted the number of the street, the town, the date the picture was made, and of course, the date the original house was made, or the house and its addition. And they interviewed the workers, who are primarily residents, and what their occupation was, the current resident's name, and generally his occupation. But what's interesting here is that Bernd has chosen to lay them into these kind of puzzles, these crossword puzzles. He was not interested in the clues. He was interested in the visual shapes. And I just think it's a miracle. Interestingly, when we were doing our research, we also found this magazine on the left, which had these winding towers, which tells us that in the 1950s, these were, typical motifs of the region. The Hamburg's Illustrated Ratzelpost was going to sell itself based on the most common, large motif in the community.
It's funny, looking at that picture on the left, they look like guard towers for a prison.
Yes, it's a little scary.
And that's not a feeling I get from their winding towers ever.
Oh. It has to do with the worm's eye view, which gives power to the form, a specter of control.
Yes.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that these industrial forms were so ubiquitous, as you say, Jeff, and the framework houses, and I don't know if we have examples here in the slideshow, but you can see in some of the larger landscape views that the workers' housing and the industrial sites were, right next to each other. I mean, that they were really integrated into the landscape. And that's different from the American industrial landscape.
Yeah, I'm not sure we have any photographs. But
I don't think we have a good example to show that. But
I was going to say, let's not move around so much. Let's just pivot to one of those pictures. Can we go back? Well, sure. Leave it here. So one of the tensions in how we read this work today, and probably how it was read as the Bechers were emerging in the 60s and 70s, was whether the Bechers were preservationists, whether they allied themselves with management or with labor. That's one of the things Max and I talked about in the essay, in the book. And we have a lot of different pathways towards that subject. But and Lucy and I talked about this the other night at the Met, is that it's complex to understand whether they're advocating for the workers who are being displaced because industry is ending, the Industrial Revolution is slowly grinding down, or the Thatcher government is basically anti-union, and they're trying to destroy the power of the coal mining unions. And this is a picture that is a picture of the end, if you will. Or they're actually looking at it more neutrally, and what is neutrality here? And maybe Lucy can talk about how his own family felt of both maybe nostalgia for the factory that was closed, but maybe some sense of freedom from the work that was done there and the struggle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I can tell you right away that my parents felt no nostalgia for industry.
Right.
They might be a little shocked to see all the red brick gone from their town, but which is something they didn't live to see. But no, I don't think anybody who's dealt with, who's been employed as a laborer in this kind of institution can feel much affection for the form. But I'm struck again and again by how awful many of those places seemed in real life, and how the Becher's work, it's not so much it disinfects it, it takes it out of the debate altogether. It looks at it from a different angle, and that angle is a studied neutrality.
Mm-hmm.
It's meant to be surrounded by the white space of the mat. It's meant to be looked at in a kind of isolation, in a kind of tranquil isolation. And of course, they didn't know either when they were making many of these pictures that in just a few decades' time, it would all be, they knew about the decline of industry, but they didn't know about the total eradication of much of this kind of stuff. It was for them a way of seeing beauty in the midst of, that wasn't how they phrase it to themselves, I'm sure, but a way of seeing beauty in the middle of blasted ugliness. Right. This winding tower in Glenronda colliery in South Wales, which makes me wish I remember the words to the Bells of Rhymney, because Rhonda shows up in there. It was, we know from the minor strikes of the 70s and so on, how awful the working conditions were in these places. And yet there is this remarkable sculptural object which deserves to be slightly removed, not to deny its function. That the denial is never present. It's not like you see, for example, American industrial photographs of the 1920s, as you see in Michael Lessie's book, Real Life, where everything is airbrushed except the machine. That's denial. They don't engage in denial, but they're saying, but wait a minute, it's awful and all that, but look at this.
Yeah, I think they recognize that one of their audiences, and one of their most devoted audiences, certainly in Germany, were the former miners or workers in these plants, in these factories, in these mines, who could appreciate maybe finally the remarkable sculptural forms that were part of their work. And they in some sense, the Bechers felt supported by that that leaning into their work by people who were perhaps painfully employed by these places.
Didn't they go back at one point even and consult with former workers when they were putting together I think it was the Zeche Concordia suite of images, because they wanted to make sure they understood the function of all of the various elements of the plant.
Yeah, their first book, was in 1970. It's tour de force, in my opinion. It's called Anonyme Sculpturen, or Anonymous Sculpture, and they divided it up into different subjects, and like we're seeing here, winding towers or water towers or blast furnaces or gravel plants, etc. But or coal bunkers like we're looking at here, but it allowed them to get architecture to front the idea of this is architecture. This is form and function coming together. And it was important enough for them to develop a technique, a grammar, to reveal it in a very specific way using black and white materials. They never worked in color. And they used large format film, which required a tripod and long exposures. And the longer these exposures meant that there was a kind of solidity, a kind of beautiful gravity. You know, there was a right face and a wrong face for every one of these structures. And that's what they worked so hard to figure out. And then there was the right light and the wrong light.
I'm being told that we have some questions, so I wonder if perhaps we ought to
Yeah, sure.
break from our conversation for people in the audience to have their questions answered. Daisy, I think you were going to read questions, or Evan?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. We do have a couple of questions. I think that I think you've covered to a certain extent their content, but perhaps he'll lead you to another angle. So to start with, Lowell asks, it's hard to imagine how familiar the Becher's imagery was when it was first shown, all the more because the Bechers have come to define a new standard of beauty, both in photography and more broadly. How do we, as diehard fans who swoon at their imagery, countenance the dilemma of aestheticizing blight and decay?
Hi, Lowell. That's a rockin' good question. I don't think they ever wanted to really photograph blight. They could easily have done so. They did not prefer to photograph these industrial buildings after they had lost their functionality. We do have some in the exhibition, but almost all of the buildings were photographed when they were operational. So I think they could have very easily have waited until everything was done and the glass was broken and the pieces were missing and the cables were slack. They didn't do that, but they were interested in breaking out of the language of pure documentary photography and creating some sort of, bridging some sort of the gap between documentary and fine art photography. And they did so with these forms, this subject. And I don't see it perhaps as blight as you may. I have always been interested in the built environment. And the same thing that brought me to Walker Evans, and I see it more positively, I think. Maybe Lucy can jump in here.
I mean, I think it would have been very interesting to see photographs of blight, but yeah, they're not. They're interested in functioning machines.
Yes.
You know, the smoothness of the operation is important to them. Dysfunction is not one of their interests. You know, again, it's neutral, but it's you know, I'm still thinking about that preservation issue. You know, I think they probably, especially in the last decade or two, they were probably racing to photograph things before they shut down. I can imagine that happening. But you know, I mean, and it's no accident really that they started their project at the very, you know, the starting gun of the decline of European heavy industry, because possibly it required that twilight perspective to make their work conceivable. So, you know, I mean, it's possible that they were sad to see many of these places go when they did go, but they were not. They just don't take a moral stance with regard to the continuation, the cessation or continuation of industry.
I like this idea of twilight.
Yeah.
This the atmospheric quality across their 50-year career of these prints, which are spectacular when you're in front of them. I highly recommend everyone on this conversation, and those that are not yet on it, come to the Met to see these works. But there is something about light on metal, which is what the negative recorded, and then Hilla as the printer somehow expanded in the printing of those negatives, which are all silver prints, gelatin silver prints. There is something that, even if we might say there is a little, not say blight, but decay, it's not a ruin, but it is made to a highly aestheticized object that delights our eye, whether it's a water tower or winding tower, things we would not traditionally describe as beautiful. But then again, you know, this was a time of, especially the 60s and 70s, you know, another time of war. I mean, much of the US was, you know, fighting in Vietnam through into the mid 70s. And they were doing their work.
One thing I'd like to say is that the thing that really surprised and delighted me the most about the show, that I wasn't prepared for at all, were their landscapes. Yeah. Because they, you know, I hadn't seen any of them. They did not put out a book of them. They didn't release them until the ends of their lives, really. And they are incredible. They are, they're pharaonic. They're massive, and they have so much detail in them, and they show you the whole cycle, including the proximity of workers' housing to the factories. You have that remarkable picture from Luxembourg of Eschwalzet, of the conveyors passing right over the workers' houses. And it's, I mean, again, there is a kind of germ-free aspect to the whole thing. They're a bit ant farm, but I mean, that's going to make it sound reductive, but I mean, they are from far enough away that you get a total picture, and you get the relation of the parts of the whole. You do not see the human beings. I mean, in many of their pictures, you know, it's not that they disrespect the workers, but for one thing, the presence of people in architectural photographs indicates scale, and scale was something they had no use for. They wanted to abolish scale in a way. And these landscape photographs are taken from a great distance away, so that even if there are people in the photographs, you can't quite make them out. But they are so varied. There are, how many of them, Jeff? 6? I don't know, 8?
You know, that 3, 6. Yeah, I think 8. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, they're amazing, and I wonder if there are any more of those.
Yes, there are. And my first thought about how in a talk like this we could talk about landscape, we could show it again on the screen, but it's about the family of buildings and the family in those buildings in their space. And much of the rest of the Becher's work was about making portraits in situ, but denying your ability to understand their relationship to each other, except in typology. And that these landscapes are astounding. I think it's very interesting, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot more writing about how the landscapes are and are not part of the story we don't know about the Bechers. So, yeah, so any other questions?
Yeah.
I think we can probably wrap up there. Unless you have any more.
No, I just was going to say it's
Comment?
just an observation, if you don't mind, which Daisy, that when I got interested in photography in the 70s and 80s, the Bechers were on everyone's tongue, whether you were an architect or a typographer or a designer or a historian, and certainly if you were a photographer. And then their students started making their way. Folks like Thomas Struth and Gursky and Candida Hoffer and Thomas Roof, we've named them, and many others, the so-called Dusseldorf School or the Becher School, which is not something they ever wanted to think about. But those artists are so much more well-known. And I feel like, in a certain sense, the Bechers haven't been taught, and this generation has not had a chance to see a retrospective ever. And this book, I hope, becomes the locus classicus for now on the Bechers. And the show, I think, will remind so many of how, both in their pedagogy and in their work itself, how extraordinary they are as models for artists working in photography or in any other medium, thinking about their work and its purpose, its own gesture to the larger world. And the Bechers are really a great subject study as an artist couple, but as pioneers on again, this movement from just photography into the other arts. They're crossover artists, as their students are.
And to have a life's project as well is something that I think would be interesting for younger artists to learn about, when so much of the art world is structured about working from show to show.
Yeah.
And this was so much bigger than that, and I imagine so much more pleasurable as an artist to work in this enormous structure which you've been created for yourself.
Yeah, they didn't even want to do exhibitions. They would prefer to do books. They felt like the exhibition was a distraction. There was not much collecting of their work. They didn't even want to do the German Pavilion in 1990 at the Biennale. They really didn't. They didn't think they needed to go. They didn't think that it was important to them. They felt like they needed to do their work.
And thank goodness.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's wrap up there. Thank you, Jeff, Lucy, and Elisa for the fascinating conversation. And I encourage you all to visit the exhibition, which is up until November 6th, and to purchase the catalogue, which you can buy from 192 Books and from the Met Museum store. 192 Books is open daily from 11 a.m. to 7 p.m. And you can also purchase it from the online store at bookshop.org. Our next event will be on July 28th. John Ashbery will be in conversation with Monica de la Tour, Lucy Ives, Shiv Koteka, and Emily Skillings to celebrate the publication of Something Close to Music, an intimate collection of Ashbery's poetry and art writings, paired with music from his personal library. And July 28th is also Ashbery's birthday. So we hope to see you there. And this recording will be posted on this page immediately afterwards if you missed the beginning or want to share it with anyone. So thank you all and have a good night.
Good night.